I stood at my kitchen window, watching families pack their belongings into cars at breakneck speed. Children were crying. Parents were shouting. Emergency vehicles lined my private road with sirens wailing. The pond that had been their weekend paradise just hours before now looked like a crime scene. 3 days earlier, I had discovered dozens of strangers camping on my property without permission. The HOA president looked me dead in the eye and told me they had every right to be there. They refused to leave. They threatened to sue me for interfering with their community event. What they did not know was the secret my ranch pond had been keeping for years. A secret that would turn their entitled weekend getaway into a nightmare they would never forget. That is when I realized they had picked the wrong property owner to mess with. I pulled into my gravel driveway after a long weekend visiting my sister in Dallas. The sun was setting behind the rolling hills of my Texas ranch, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I had been looking forward to the peace and quiet of home after 3 days in the city. That peace shattered the moment I saw them. Dozens of tents dotted the area around my private pond. Recreational vehicles were parked in neat rows across my pasture. Families with children were everywhere, swimming in my water, fishing from my banks, treating my property like their personal resort. The sound of laughter and splashing water filled the air where only silence should have existed. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. This was my land, my sanctuary, the place I had bought specifically to escape exactly this kind of invasion. I parked near my house and walked toward the chaos, my boots crunching on the grass that had been trampled by dozens of feet. A woman in a folding chair looked up from her book and smiled at me like I was a neighbor dropping by for a visit. The rage building in my chest made it hard to breathe. I found their leader near the largest RV, a man in his 50s wearing a polo shirt with an embroidered logo that read Sunset Valley HOA President. He was directing traffic like he owned the place, pointing families toward different camping spots around my pond. "Excuse me," I said, my voice tight with control. "You are on private property. You need to leave immediately." He turned to face me with the kind of smile politicians use when they think you are stupid. "And you are the owner of this land, the person whose property you are trespassing on." His smile widened. "Oh, you must be confused. This is community property now. We have every right to be here for our annual camping event." The words hit me like a physical blow. Community property, this is my ranch. I have owned this land for 8 years. "Not anymore," he said, pulling out a folder thick with documents. "Our HOA has expanded to include this area. We sent notice to all affected properties months ago. You should have received the paperwork." I stared at him in disbelief. I never received any paperwork because this property has never been part of any HOA. I bought it specifically to avoid dealing with people like you. His expression hardened. "Well, things change. Property values in this area have improved significantly since we took over management. You should be thanking us." "Get off my land," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I think you need to review the legal documents before making any hasty demands," he replied, his tone now openly condescending. "In fact, if you continue to interfere with our community event, we will be forced to pursue legal action against you for harassment." The audacity of his threat left me speechless for a moment. Behind him, children were jumping off a rope swing into my pond while their parents cheered. Someone had set up a barbecue grill near my favorite fishing spot. I looked around at the dozens of families enjoying themselves on my property, completely oblivious to the confrontation happening 20 feet away. They had turned my peaceful ranch into a carnival, and their so-called president was threatening to sue me for objecting. "You have until tomorrow morning to pack up and leave," I said. "Every tent, every RV, every piece of trash you brought onto my property. We will be here through Sunday evening as planned," he replied calmly. "I suggest you call a lawyer if you have issues with the new property management structure." I turned and walked back to my house without another word. My hands were shaking with fury, but my mind was already working. These people thought they could just take whatever they wanted through paperwork and intimidation. They thought I would roll over and accept their version of reality. They had no idea what they had just walked into. As I sat on my porch watching families swim in my pond, a dark smile crossed my face. These entitled trespassers were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. They had chosen the wrong pond for their little community event. The secret my water had been keeping was about to become their worst nightmare. I sat in my kitchen that night, staring out at the campfires dotting my property, remembering exactly why I had fled to this ranch in the first place. The memories came flooding back like a dam bursting open. 5 years earlier, I had lived in a suburban neighborhood called Meadowbrook Estates. It seemed perfect at first: well-maintained homes, friendly neighbors, reasonable HOA fees. But perfection, I learned, always comes with a price. The Meadowbrook HOA started small. A notice about keeping grass height under 3 inches, a reminder about approved mailbox colors, harmless community standards that made sense on paper. But power, I discovered, is like a drug to certain people. The more they get, the more they crave. Within 2 years, the violations started flying. My fence was 6 inches too tall. My car was parked 3 feet too far from the curb. My rose bushes were not on the approved landscaping list. Each violation came with a fine. Each fine came with a deadline. Each deadline came with threats of legal action. The worst part was not the money. It was the feeling of being watched, judged, controlled in my own home. I would come home from work to find HOA board members measuring my grass with rulers. I would wake up to notices taped to my door about infractions I had committed while sleeping. The final straw came when they tried to fine me for painting my front door the wrong shade of blue. According to their records, I had submitted paperwork for ocean mist, but had actually used coastal breeze. The difference was so subtle that even the paint store employee could not tell them apart without the color codes. That night, I made a decision that changed everything. I would not live under the thumb of petty tyrants who measured their worth by how much they could control other people. I would find a place where I could breathe freely, where my property was actually my property. The ranch had been perfect. 87 acres of rolling hills and open sky, with a beautiful natural pond fed by a spring. No neighbors within a mile. No HOA anywhere in sight. I had checked 3 times before signing the papers. This was my escape from the suffocating world of community associations and their power-hungry leadership. For 8 years, I had enjoyed complete freedom. I could park my truck wherever I wanted. I could paint my house any color that struck my fancy. I could wake up each morning to silence instead of the sound of neighbors arguing about property line disputes. But freedom, I was learning, is something certain people cannot tolerate in others. The Sunset Valley HOA had been expanding aggressively for the past 3 years. I had heard rumors from friends in town about their tactics. They would target unincorporated areas with nice properties, then use legal loopholes to annex them into their jurisdiction. Property owners would wake up one day to find themselves subject to rules they had never agreed to follow. I had dismissed the rumors as conspiracy theories. No HOA could simply claim property that was never part of their community. Property rights were sacred in Texas. The law was on the side of legitimate owners. Sitting at my kitchen table, watching strangers roast marshmallows over fires built on my land, I realized how naive I had been. These people did not care about law or property rights. They cared about control, and they were willing to use any method necessary to get it. The camping event was not random. It was a declaration of ownership. They had chosen this specific weekend because they knew I would be out of town. They had planned this invasion carefully, probably monitoring my movements for weeks. The pond made perfect sense as their target. It was the crown jewel of my property, a natural water feature that would make their community events feel special and exclusive. They probably imagined years of summer gatherings, with families paying premium HOA fees for access to waterfront recreation. What they had not bothered to research was the history of my pond. They saw clear water and assumed it was clean. They saw a natural spring and assumed it was pure. They saw families swimming and assumed it was safe. They were about to learn the difference between assumption and reality. My cattle and horses had been using this pond for 8 years. Every day, dozens of animals came down to drink, to cool off, to do what animals do in and around water. The spring kept everything flowing, but natural processes do not eliminate everything that flows in. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures of the camping event. If these people wanted to play legal games, I would be ready. Every tent, every vehicle, every person trespassing on my property was now documented. They thought they were entitled to take whatever they wanted. Tomorrow, they would discover that entitlement has consequences. The next morning, I stood on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the chaos unfold around my pond. Families were emerging from tents. Children were running toward the water in swimsuits, and the smell of bacon was drifting from multiple camp stoves across my property. They had no idea what they were getting themselves into. My ranch operated on a simple principle that every farmer and rancher understands: water flows downhill, and everything in its path comes along for the ride. The pond they were treating like a pristine swimming hole was actually the collection point for runoff from my entire cattle and horse operation. The spring that fed the pond was natural and clean, but it mixed with surface water that had traveled across 87 acres of pasture land. Water that had flowed through areas where my 43 head of cattle spent their days eating, drinking, and relieving themselves. Water that passed through the paddocks where my 12 horses did exactly what horses do when nature calls. The pond looked crystal clear because the spring kept it moving, and the natural settling process pushed heavier particles to the bottom. But clear water and clean water are two completely different things. What these families could not see was the invisible contamination that came from months of animal waste washing into their weekend paradise. I had noticed the problem years ago when I first moved to the ranch. A few fish kills during hot summers had taught me that the pond was not suitable for drinking or swimming. The contamination levels were not dangerous enough to harm the cattle. They had built up immunity over time, but humans were a different story entirely. The previous owner had warned me about the water quality, but I had not cared. I was not planning to swim in it. I wanted the pond for its beauty and its value to the livestock. The contamination was just a fact of ranch life, like mud after rain or dust during dry spells. But these HOA invaders had not bothered to ask about water quality. They had seen a beautiful pond and assumed it was safe for their children. Their arrogance had blinded them to basic questions that any responsible parent would ask before letting kids swim in unfamiliar water. I watched a group of children playing on inflatable rafts, splashing each other and diving underwater. Their parents sat in lawn chairs nearby, sipping drinks and laughing at their kids' antics. The scene would have been heartwarming if it had been happening in clean water. The moral dilemma hit me like a punch to the gut. These children were innocent victims of their parents' entitled behavior. They did not deserve to get sick because adults had decided to trespass on private property. Basic human decency demanded that I warn them about the contamination. But another part of me remembered the HOA president's smug threats from the day before. These people had refused to leave when asked politely. They had claimed ownership of my property through legal intimidation. They had turned my sanctuary into their playground without permission or consideration. Maybe natural consequences were exactly what entitled behavior deserved. I pulled out my phone and started recording everything. Parents encouraging children to jump off rocks into contaminated water. Families filling water bottles from the pond for drinking. Teenagers having diving contests in the deepest areas where waste particles settled most heavily. If anyone got sick from this water, the legal responsibility would fall squarely on the people who had trespassed onto private property and ignored basic safety precautions. I had documentation proving they were here without permission. I had witnesses to their refusal to leave when warned about the trespass. The decision made itself. I would not actively harm these families, but I would not save them from their own poor choices either. Sometimes the best lessons come from experiencing natural consequences firsthand. I watched a father teaching his young daughter to fish from the bank where my horses came to drink every morning. The irony was almost too perfect. They were literally fishing in toilet water while acting like they owned the place. The contamination levels were not life-threatening, but they were definitely going to cause some uncomfortable symptoms over the next day or two. Stomach upset, skin irritation, maybe some digestive issues. Nothing permanent, but enough to make everyone involved reconsider their decision-making process. I went inside and called my attorney to discuss the trespassing situation. If these people wanted to play legal games, I would be ready with documentation, witness statements, and a clear record of their refusal to respect property rights. By the time I finished my phone call, more families had arrived for the second day of camping. The contaminated pond was getting busier by the hour. Nature was about to teach a lesson that no HOA rulebook could contain. Saturday morning brought even more chaos to my property. Word had apparently spread about the wonderful community pond, because a steady stream of vehicles was arriving with additional families ready to join the unauthorized celebration. I counted at least 60 people now scattered around my pond, with more arriving every hour. Children were everywhere building sandcastles on my beach, catching minnows in the shallows, playing water tag in the deeper areas. Their parents had fully embraced the fiction that this was their community amenity, setting up elaborate camps with portable grills, speaker systems, and enough supplies for a week-long festival. The HOA president was holding court near the largest RV, welcoming newcomers and directing them to prime camping spots like he was running a luxury resort. Every time I saw his smug face, my blood pressure spiked another 10 points. But by afternoon, the first cracks in their perfect weekend were starting to show. I noticed it during lunch hour when a woman emerged from one of the portable restrooms looking pale and shaky. She sat down heavily in a folding chair and called for her husband with a voice that carried worry. Within minutes, I saw her rushing back to the restroom facilities, moving with the urgent gait of someone fighting an upset stomach. An hour later, a father was helping his young son out of the water, the boy complaining loudly about his tummy hurting. The kid looked green around the gills and kept asking to go home. His mother dismissed it as too much excitement and too many camp snacks, but I could see the concern growing in her eyes. By late afternoon, the pattern was unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Families who had spent the most time in and around the water were starting to show signs of distress. Stomach complaints were spreading through the camp like wildfire. Several children had developed red, itchy skin after their swimming sessions. I watched from my porch as parents tried to rationalize what they were seeing. Too much sun, bad camp food, allergic reactions to unfamiliar plants, anything except the obvious explanation that their pristine swimming hole was contaminated with livestock waste. The HOA president was getting increasingly defensive as more families approached him with concerns. I could hear fragments of his responses carried on the evening breeze. These things happen during outdoor events. Children always get upset stomachs when they eat too much junk food. The water has been tested and approved for community use. That last lie made my jaw clench. No testing had been done because this was not community property. But rather than admit the truth about their illegal occupation of my land, he was doubling down with fabricated assurances about water safety. As darkness fell, portable lanterns and campfires illuminated a scene that was becoming less festive by the hour. The excited chatter of the morning had been replaced by worried conversations and the sounds of children crying. Multiple families were dealing with sick kids, but instead of connecting the dots to water contamination, they were treating each case as an isolated incident. I pulled out my phone and started documenting the health issues I could observe from a distance. Parents taking children to cars for privacy while dealing with bathroom emergencies. Families packing up early and leaving without explanation. The gradual spread of illness through the group of people who had spent the most time swimming. The moral weight of my decision was getting heavier by the hour. These were real families with real children who were suffering because adults had made arrogant choices about property rights. Part of me wanted to march down there and warn everyone about the contamination before more people got sick. But another part of me remembered the HOA president's threats about legal action. These people had invaded my property, refused to leave, and claimed ownership through intimidation tactics. They had created this situation through their own entitled behavior. Natural consequences were teaching a lesson that polite requests had failed to deliver. Around midnight, I heard vehicles starting up and leaving. Several families had apparently decided that cutting their weekend short was better than dealing with whatever was making everyone sick. But the majority remained, still convinced that their problems were coincidental rather than connected to their choice of swimming location. The HOA president was making rounds through the camp, reassuring worried parents and maintaining his fiction about water safety. His confidence was impressive considering that he had no actual knowledge about the pond's condition. But confidence, I was learning, could carry someone pretty far even when reality was working against them. As I finally went to bed, I could hear the sounds of a camp dealing with a medical crisis they refused to acknowledge. Crying children, worried parents, and the unmistakable sounds of people dealing with gastrointestinal distress in portable facilities never designed for that level of use. Tomorrow would bring the moment of truth. The contamination levels were not dangerous enough to cause serious harm, but they were definitely high enough to make Sunday morning unforgettable for everyone involved. Justice was about to be served by the laws of nature. Sunday morning arrived with the sound of chaos. Even before I got out of bed, I could hear children crying, parents shouting, and vehicles starting up in panic. The peaceful sounds of a camping weekend had been replaced by the unmistakable noise of families dealing with a medical emergency. I looked out my bedroom window to see people rushing between tents and portable facilities. The scene looked like a disaster zone. Parents were carrying sick children to cars while other adults stood around in groups, talking in urgent, worried voices. The party atmosphere had completely evaporated. By the time I made it to my kitchen with a cup of coffee, at least 10 families had already packed up and left. Their abandoned camping spots dotted the area around my pond like craters from an explosion. The families who remained looked shell-shocked and exhausted. The real panic started around 9 in the morning when multiple families simultaneously realized that their children were seriously ill. Not just upset stomachs or minor discomfort, but full-blown gastrointestinal distress that was sending parents into protective overdrive. I watched through my window as a mother emerged from a tent carrying a small boy who was clearly dehydrated and weak. She was shouting for help, her voice cracking with fear. Within minutes, other parents were gathering around, comparing symptoms and realizing that nearly every family had at least one person dealing with severe stomach problems. That was when the HOA president finally started to panic. I could see him moving frantically between groups of families, his earlier confidence replaced by obvious fear. He was on his phone constantly, making call after call with increasing desperation. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in. Dozens of families were getting sick on his watch, and he had no explanation that would not expose his lies about water safety. Around 10:30, I made my decision. I could not watch children suffer any longer, regardless of how I felt about their parents' behavior. I gathered the documentation I had been collecting and walked down to face the chaos. The scene up close was worse than it had looked from my porch. Children were lying in tents looking pale and weak. Parents were trying to comfort kids who could not stop crying. The smell of illness hung in the air despite the open outdoor setting. This was not just stomach upset anymore. This was a full-scale medical crisis. I found the HOA president near his RV, surrounded by angry parents demanding answers. His polo shirt was soaked with sweat, and his face had the gray pallor of someone who knew he was in serious trouble. "Excuse me," I said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I think I can explain what is happening here." The crowd turned toward me with desperate hope. Parents holding sick children stepped closer, looking for any information that might help their families. "You are all suffering from contamination exposure," I said clearly. "This pond is not safe for swimming or any kind of water contact." The HOA president started to object, but I cut him off. "This water collects runoff from 87 acres of cattle and horse pastures. It contains livestock waste that has been accumulating here for years. Every person who swam in this pond, every child who played in this water, has been exposed to dangerous levels of contamination." The silence that followed was deafening. Parents stared at me in horror, processing what I had just told them. Then the questions started flying. "Why did you not warn us? How long has this water been contaminated? What kind of health problems are we looking at?" I held up my hands for quiet. "I did warn you. I told your president here that you were trespassing on private property and needed to leave immediately. He refused and threatened to sue me for interfering with your event." All eyes turned to the HOA president, who was now backing toward his RV like a cornered animal. "You knew," a mother shouted, her voice rising to a scream. "You knew this water was dangerous and you let our children swim in it." We had documentation that this was community property," he stammered. "The water was supposed to be tested." By who? I demanded. This is private property that has never been part of any HOA. You have no authority here and no knowledge of local conditions. You brought these families onto contaminated land without permission or safety precautions. The crowd was turning ugly fast. Parents who had been worried about their children's health were now realizing that trusted community leadership had put their families in danger through negligence and lies. Everyone needs to get to a hospital immediately, I continued. The contamination is not life-threatening, but you need medical attention for dehydration and possible infection, especially the children. That announcement broke the dam completely. Parents started running toward their cars, grabbing sick children and essential belongings while leaving everything else behind. The organized camping event dissolved into pure chaos as families fled toward medical help. Within an hour, my property looked like the aftermath of a natural disaster. Abandoned tents, scattered belongings, and overturned camping equipment were scattered around the pond. But the people were gone, racing toward hospitals and urgent care centers with their contaminated children. The HOA president was the last to leave, loading his RV with shaking hands while avoiding eye contact with me. As he drove away, I knew this was just the beginning of his problems. The truth had finally erupted, and there would be no containing the consequences. The phone calls started before noon on Sunday. Local news stations had picked up reports about mass illness at an unauthorized camping event, and they wanted statements from the property owner. By Monday morning, my quiet ranch had become the center of a media storm that would make national headlines. The first major development came when the county health department arrived to test my pond water. Environmental specialists in hazmat suits collected samples while news cameras rolled, creating dramatic footage that would play on television for weeks. The test results confirmed what I had already known: contamination levels were high enough to cause the symptoms everyone had experienced. But the real bombshell dropped when investigators started looking into the HOA's legal claims about property ownership. What they discovered was a pattern of fraudulent expansion that went far beyond my ranch. The Sunset Valley HOA had been using forged documents to claim authority over properties that had never been part of their community. They would file fake incorporation papers with the county, create bogus property surveys, and then present homeowners with official-looking documents, claiming they were now subject to HOA rules and fees. Most people, faced with legal-sounding paperwork and threats of lawsuits, simply paid the fees rather than fight. The HOA had been collecting thousands of dollars in fraudulent assessments from property owners who had no idea they were being scammed. My attorney was practically giddy when he called with the news. "They have been running this con for at least 3 years," he said. "Your case is going to bring down their entire operation." The medical consequences were more serious than I had initially expected. While no one suffered permanent harm, several children required hospital treatment for dehydration and bacterial infections. The total medical bills for all affected families exceeded $50,000, and every single cent of it would become evidence in the criminal case building against the HOA leadership. Parents who had trusted community officials to keep their children safe were now discovering that those same officials had knowingly put families at risk through illegal trespassing and negligent safety practices. The anger was palpable at every news conference and community meeting. The HOA president, whose name was Gerald Hoskins, hired a crisis management firm and tried to shift blame onto me for not warning families about water contamination. His lawyer argued that property owners have a duty to protect trespassers from hidden dangers, even when those trespassers refused to leave. That strategy backfired spectacularly when my attorney released recordings of the initial confrontation, where Hoskins had threatened legal action against me for asking them to leave. The audio clearly showed that he had claimed authority over my property while dismissing my warnings about trespassing. The criminal charges came down like an avalanche. Hoskins faced counts of fraud, reckless endangerment, criminal trespass, and conspiracy to commit theft. 3 other HOA board members were also indicted for their roles in the fraudulent expansion scheme. But the civil lawsuits were even more devastating. Every family that had suffered medical consequences filed suit against both the HOA and its leadership personally. The total damages being sought exceeded $2 million, far more than the HOA's insurance would cover. My phone rang constantly with calls from other property owners who had been victimized by similar HOA scams. Stories poured in about fake violations, fraudulent fees, and threats of legal action designed to intimidate people into compliance. The scope of the fraud was staggering. The media attention transformed my story from local news into a national symbol of HOA overreach and the importance of property rights. I appeared on 3 different television programs, each time telling the same basic story entitled "Officials had invaded private property, ignored safety warnings, and put children at risk through arrogance and fraud." The interview that got the most attention was with a legal affairs program, where I was asked whether I felt guilty about not warning families sooner about the water contamination. "I warned the person in charge that they were trespassing and needed to leave," I said. "He threatened to sue me and claimed they had legal authority to be there. When someone refuses to respect your property rights and threatens you for defending them, you do not owe them anything beyond basic human decency." But children got sick, the interviewer pressed. Children got sick because their parents trusted fraudulent leadership that put community politics ahead of child safety. The real question is why parents did not ask basic questions about water quality before letting their kids swim in an unfamiliar pond. That response generated hundreds of supportive messages from viewers who understood that personal responsibility could not be replaced by blaming property owners for the consequences of other people's poor decisions. The legal proceedings dragged on for months, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The evidence of fraud was overwhelming, the medical consequences were documented, and the pattern of similar crimes was undeniable. Hoskins eventually pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for cooperating with investigations into other fraudulent HOAs operating similar schemes across Texas. His cooperation led to additional indictments and helped recover stolen fees for dozens of victimized property owners. The civil settlements were substantial but confidential. What I can say is that the compensation was sufficient to make major improvements to my ranch, including proper fencing and security systems that would prevent future trespassing incidents. More importantly, the case established legal precedent that would make it much harder for fraudulent HOAs to operate similar schemes in the future. Property rights had been defended not just for me, but for everyone who might face similar threats. Justice had been served, but the cost had been higher than anyone anticipated. 6 months after the camping disaster, I stood in the same spot where I had first discovered trespassers on my property. But now, instead of unauthorized tents and RVs, I was looking at newly installed security fencing and clearly marked property boundaries that left no doubt about where my land began and ended. The legal settlements had been finalized the previous month. The fraudulent HOA had been dissolved permanently, its assets distributed among the victims of their scams. Gerald Hoskins had been sentenced to 18 months in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution that would keep him financially devastated for years to come. But the real victory was not measured in money or jail time. It was measured in the respect for property rights that had been restored through this battle. The story had taken on a life of its own in the media. Property rights organizations used my case as an example of what could be accomplished when individuals stood firm against bureaucratic overreach. Legal experts cited the precedent in cases involving HOA fraud across multiple states. I received letters from property owners all over the country who had faced similar harassment from power-hungry community associations. Many shared stories of fake violations, fraudulent fees, and threats designed to intimidate people into submission. The common thread in every letter was gratitude for showing that entitled authorities could be defeated when their behavior crossed legal and ethical lines. The pond itself had become a symbol of natural justice prevailing over artificial authority. Environmental testing confirmed that the contamination levels, while unpleasant, had not caused any permanent health problems for the families exposed. The children who had gotten sick made full recoveries, though their parents remained deeply angry about the unnecessary trauma they had endured. I had implemented a comprehensive water management system that separated livestock areas from the pond's recreational potential. Not because I planned to allow swimming, but because responsible stewardship meant taking care of natural resources properly. The pond was clearer and healthier than it had been in years. The most satisfying moment came when several former HOA members approached me individually to apologize for their association's behavior. These were people who had genuinely believed they were participating in legitimate community activities, not criminal fraud schemes. They had been victims too, manipulated by leadership that cared more about power and money than community welfare. One conversation particularly stood out. A woman named Sarah had been among the families camping that weekend, and her 8-year-old daughter had been hospitalized for dehydration. She visited my ranch to personally apologize and to thank me for ultimately telling the truth about the water contamination. "I was so angry at first," she admitted. "I thought you should have warned us immediately, regardless of the trespassing situation. But after learning about all the fraud and lies, I understand that you were the only person telling the truth that entire weekend." Her daughter had drawn me a picture of the pond with a sign that read, "Private property, ask permission." It was hanging on my refrigerator as a reminder that sometimes the most important lessons come from the youngest voices. The national attention had brought unexpected opportunities. I had been invited to speak at property rights conferences and to consult with legal teams handling similar cases. The story had inspired legislation in 3 states that strengthened protections against fraudulent HOA expansion and made it easier for property owners to defend themselves against illegitimate claims. My ranch had become a destination for people interested in seeing where the pond revenge story had taken place. I gave occasional tour to journalists, legal experts, and property rights advocates who wanted to understand how one person's refusal to back down had exposed a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. But the most important victory was personal. I had my peace back. My sanctuary was truly private again, protected by clear boundaries and legal precedent that would deter future trespassers. I could sit on my porch in the evening and listen to silence instead of the sounds of entitled strangers treating my property like their personal playground. The cattle and horses continued their daily routine of drinking from the pond, oblivious to the national controversy it had generated. Their simple presence served as a reminder that natural processes do not respect human arrogance or artificial authority. Reality always wins in the end, regardless of what people choose to believe. On quiet mornings, I would walk down to the pond and remember the chaos that had unfolded here. Families fleeing in panic, children crying from contamination they never should have faced, and a fraudulent leader finally confronting the consequences of his lies and greed. The water was clear now, reflecting the open sky and rolling hills that had drawn me to this place originally. It was beautiful and peaceful, exactly as it should be. But beneath that serene surface lay the memory of justice delivered through natural consequences that no amount of entitlement could overcome. Sometimes the best revenge is simply allowing entitled people to face the reality they have created through their own poor choices. Nature has a way of teaching lessons that human authorities cannot, and those lessons tend to be remembered long after legal judgments are forgotten. My pond had taught the ultimate lesson about respecting boundaries, both legal and natural, and that lesson would ripple outward for years to come.